An enslaved man and woman made vows before God, but their love was a crime that could cost them everything. On a plantation where even whispered prayers were dangerous, Micah and Naomi dared to call themselves husband and wife. But when a jealous field hand betrayed them to the brutal overseer, their secret ceremony became their death sentence. The punishment was swift, the separation was cruel, and the threat of being sold away from each other forever hung over them like a shadow. But then, a traveling preacher arrived with a dangerous offer, a map to freedom through the Underground Railroad. Now, chained in a wagon and heading toward a slave auction, where they'll be sold to the highest bidder, they face an impossible choice. Will a shocking ally emerge from the one place they least expect? Or will their love story end on the auction block, separated forever by the crack of the auctioneer's gavel? When freedom comes at the ultimate price, how far would you run for love? The first rays of dawn broke soft and golden over Harwood Plantation, painting the whitewashed manor house in shades of amber and rose. The air hung thick with dew, and somewhere in the distance, a rooster called out to greet the morning. Micah was already awake, had been for near an hour, his hands working steady at the broken wagon wheel propped against the old oak tree. He was a tall man, lean and strong, with careful hands that knew their way around wood and metal. The wheel had cracked 2 days prior, when Overseer Briggs had driven the supply wagon too hard over the rutted road. Now it fell to Micah to fix what rough handling had broken. He didn't mind. The work gave him time to think, time to breathe before the day's demands pressed down on him like a heavy stone. The plantation was stirring to life around him. Doors creaked open in the quarters, a row of small cabins that housed the enslaved men and women who worked from sunup to sundown. Smoke began to curl from chimneys as folks set fires for their morning grits. Children's voices rose in play before they'd be called to chores. The morning smelled of wood smoke and red clay earth, of growing things, and the promise of another hot day ahead. Micah looked up from his work when he heard the soft rustle of fabric. Naomi was coming across the yard, a basket of wet linens balanced on her hip. She moved with a grace that made even heavy labor look light, her dark skin glowing in the early sun, her eyes clear and kind. She'd tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, and a few curls had escaped to frame her face. "Morning, Micah," she said, her voice gentle as summer rain. "Morning, Naomi." He wiped his hands on his worn trousers and nodded toward the clothesline. "Reckon it'll be a good drying day." "I reckon so." She began pinning up the sheets, her movements quick and practiced. They'd lived on this plantation all their lives, had grown up in these same quarters, but only in recent months had Micah begun to notice the way his heart lifted when she came near. Only recently had he dared to hope she might feel the same. They didn't speak much. Words were dangerous things when Overseer Briggs might be listening from his porch, or when Miss Harwood might glance out a window. But their silence held a comfort, a shared understanding that needed no explaining. As the sun climbed higher, painting the cotton fields in brilliant white and green, Briggs emerged from his small house near the barn. He was a hard man with a harder face, all sharp angles and suspicious eyes. He carried a ledger under one arm and a whip coiled at his belt, a reminder that he held power over every soul who worked this land. "Micah." His voice cut across the yard. "That wheel fixed yet?" "Nearly done, sir." Micah kept his tone respectful, his eyes down. "Better be. Mr. Harwood needs that wagon by noon." Briggs spat into the dirt and moved on, already shouting at a group of field hands to get to their rows. Naomi caught Micah's eye for just a moment, and something passed between them, a shared weariness, a quiet strength. Then she gathered her empty basket and headed toward the manor house, where she'd spend her day in the kitchen, helping cook prepare meals for the Harwood family. Micah watched her go, then turned back to his wheel. The morning stretched before him, full of labor and heat, but somewhere beneath it all, a small seed of hope had taken root in his chest. A hope that maybe, somehow, there could be more to life than this endless cycle of work and watchfulness. The evening came soft and purple, bringing relief from the day's blazing heat. After the work was done, after the fields were picked and the animals fed, after the manor's supper dishes were washed and put away, the enslaved community gathered in the largest cabin in the quarters. This was their time, their space, and though it was sanctioned by Mr. Harwood as part of keeping his workers manageable, it belonged to them in ways the master could never understand. Old Jonah led these gatherings. He was ancient as the oak trees, his hair white as cotton bolls, his face creased with lines that spoke of a long life lived under the weight of bondage. But his eyes still burned bright with something unbreakable, something that all the years of cruelty couldn't diminish. He stood at the front of the cabin now, his hands raised, his voice rising strong and clear. "Children of the Lord," he began, and the words wrapped around them like a warm quilt. "We gather here tonight in the sight of God, who sees all things, who knows all hearts." Micah sat on a rough bench near the back, And when Naomi slipped in through the door, he shifted to make room beside him. She settled there, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and he felt the warmth of her presence, like sunshine breaking through clouds. Jonah's sermon was about dignity, about remembering that no matter what the world said, no matter how they were treated, they were children of God, precious, worthy, beloved. His words painted pictures of a better world, a world where chains would fall away and every soul would stand free beneath heaven's wide sky. "The Lord sees your labor," Jonah said, his voice trembling with conviction. "He sees your pain, he sees your tears, and he is not blind to injustice. No, sir. The day will come when all accounts are settled, when every wrong is made right." Around the cabin, people swayed and hummed, their voices joining in soft affirmation. Naomi's hand found Micah's in the dim light, her fingers threading through his. His heart hammered in his chest. This small touch, this simple gesture, held more courage than most folks would ever understand. When the meeting ended and people began to disperse, careful to return to their cabins before curfew, Micah walked Naomi to her doorway. The night was full of cricket song and the distant hoot of an owl. Stars scattered across the sky like diamonds spilled on black velvet. "Jonah's words tonight," Naomi said quietly, "they made me think about what's possible. Even here." Micah nodded, his throat tight. "I've been thinking the same." She turned to face him, and in the moonlight, her eyes shone with something he couldn't quite name: hope, maybe, or determination. "We deserve more than this, Micah. We deserve to be seen, to be honored." "We do," he agreed. Then, gathering his courage like a man about to leap across a chasm, he added, "Naomi, I'd be honored if you'd let me, if you'd consider, ... Double quotes, the words tangled on his tongue. She smiled, soft and knowing. "I'd be honored to, Micah." They stood there a moment longer, the night air sweet around them, before she slipped inside and he made his way back to the men's quarters. As he lay on his thin mattress later, staring up at the dark ceiling, Micah felt something shift inside him. It was like a door opening, letting light into a room that had been shuttered too long. The manor kitchen was sweltering by mid-morning, the great iron stove radiating heat that made sweat pour down Naomi's back as she worked. Cook, a heavy-set woman named Bessie, who'd served the Harwoods for 30 years, moved between pots with practiced efficiency, barking gentle orders at Naomi and the other kitchen girl. A young thing named Ruth. "Naomi, those potatoes need peeling faster. The mistress wants her luncheon at noon sharp." "Yes, ma'am." Naomi's knife moved quick over the potato skin, her mind only half on the task. The other half was back in the quarters, thinking about Micah, about the way his hand had felt holding hers, about the future that seemed to shimmer just beyond reach. Through the kitchen door, she could hear the sounds of the manor house footsteps on polished floors, the murmur of voices, the clock in the hall, chiming the hour. The Harwoods lived in a different world than the one Naomi inhabited, though their worlds existed side by side, separated by walls that might as well have been made of stone a mile thick. That evening, after the dishes were done and the kitchen scrubbed clean, Naomi slipped out the back door. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She made her way to the far corner of the quarters, where a small stand of trees provided privacy from prying eyes. Micah was waiting there, and with him stood old Jonah. 2 other friends had come to Sarah, who worked in the laundry, and Thomas, who tended the horses. They were witnesses, but more than that, they were family. The family you chose when your blood family had been sold away, or lost to time and distance. Jonah's voice was quiet, but firm as he began. There were no fancy words, no written vows, no legal papers. The law didn't recognize marriages between enslaved people to the law. They were property, and property couldn't make contracts. But in the eyes of God, and in the hearts of those who loved them, what happened in that small grove of trees was as sacred as any ceremony in the grandest church. "Micah," Jonah said, "do you take this woman, Naomi, to be your wife, to honor and protect her, to stand beside her in joy and sorrow, as long as the Lord gives you breath?" "I do." Micah's voice was steady, his eyes on Naomi's face. "I surely do." "And Naomi, do you take this man, Micah, to be your husband, to honor and support him, to stand beside him in joy and sorrow, as long as the Lord gives you breath?" "I do." Her voice was clear as a bell. "With all my heart." Jonah smiled, his old face crinkling with joy. "Then in the sight of God and these witnesses, I say you are joined together. What God has brought together, let no man put asunder." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple ribbon, faded blue. He tied it gently around their clasped hands. "May this be a sign of the bond you share." Sarah was crying softly, happy tears streaming down her face. Thomas clapped Micah on the shoulder. For one perfect moment, They were just people celebrating love, just human beings, marking a milestone of joy. Then the moment passed, and reality settled back over them like a heavy cloak. They couldn't linger. They couldn't risk being caught out after curfew. Naomi squeezed Micah's hand one more time, memorizing the feel of it, before she hurried back to the women's cabin. As she lay in her bunk that night, the ribbon tucked carefully beneath her thin pillow, Naomi felt something new blooming in her chest. It was fragile as a seedling, but it was real, a sense of belonging, of being chosen, of having someone in this world who saw her not as property, but as precious. Outside, the night sounds of the plantation continued, the rustle of leaves, the call of a night bird, the distant bark of a dog. Inside, Naomi closed her eyes and let herself dream of a future that might hold more than chains and sorrow. She dreamed of freedom, of walking hand in hand with Micah, down a road that led somewhere new, somewhere bright with possibility. It was a dangerous dream, but it was hers. Morning came too soon, as it always did. The quarters stirred to life with the pre-dawn ritual of preparing for another day's labor. Levi, a field hand with shoulders broad from years of picking cotton, stood near the tool shed watching as folks gathered their implements for the day ahead. Levi was a complicated man. He worked hard, kept his head down mostly, but inside him lived a bitter seed that had been growing for years. He'd admired Naomi from a distance for a long time, had imagined that maybe one day she'd notice him, see him as something more than just another pair of hands in the field. But she'd never looked at him the way she looked at Micah. Yesterday, he'd overheard Sarah and Ruth talking in hushed tones about a joining ceremony. They'd said Naomi's name, they'd said Micah's name, and Levi had felt something hot and angry rise up in his chest. Now, as he watched Micah walk past with that quiet dignity he carried, Levi felt that anger sharpen into something harder. It wasn't fair. What made Micah special? What gave him the right to claim someone, when the rest of them had nothing? Overseer Briggs emerged from his house, ledger in hand, already surveying the yard with those cold, calculating eyes. Levi found himself drifting closer to the overseer's office, his heart pounding with a mix of resentment and something that felt like purpose. Maybe Briggs would want to know about unauthorized gatherings. Maybe there was favor to be gained by showing loyalty, by proving himself useful. The overseers always rewarded those who helped maintain order, didn't they? Levi lingered near the doorway, watching Briggs bark orders at a group of field hands. The morning sun was climbing higher, casting sharp shadows across the yard. Inside Levi's chest, his conscience and his bitterness waged a quiet war. He thought about Naomi's kind smile, about how she'd once brought him water when he'd been sick with fever. He thought about Micah, who'd never done him any wrong, who'd even helped him repair his cabin roof after a storm last spring. These were good people. They didn't deserve whatever punishment Briggs might dole out. But then he thought about his own loneliness, about the years of backbreaking labor with nothing to show for it, about how some folks seemed to find happiness even in this place, while he remained empty and overlooked. The war inside him raged on as the morning unfolded around him, each moment pulling him closer to a choice that would change everything. Inside the manor house, Naomi moved through her duties with practiced efficiency. She helped cook prepare breakfast for the Harwood family, eggs and ham, fresh biscuits with butter and preserves, hot coffee served in delicate china cups. The dining room gleamed with polished silver and starched linens, a sharp contrast to the rough-hewn tables in the quarters. Mrs. Harwood was a thin woman with sharp features and an air of perpetual dissatisfaction. She presided over breakfast like a general overseeing troops, commenting on every detail, finding fault with the temperature of the coffee or the arrangement of flowers in the centerpiece. "Naomi," she said, without looking up from her plate, "you'll need to stay through the afternoon. I'm expecting visitors, Mrs. Pemberton and Mrs. Crawford. We'll need tea service prepared." "Yes, ma'am." Naomi kept her eyes respectfully downcast, though inside, her heart sank. Extra hours in the manor meant less time in the quarters, less chance of seeing Micah. Mr. Harwood sat at the head of the table, a portly man with a florid face and an air of self-importance. He was reading the newspaper, making occasional grunts of agreement or disapproval at whatever he found on the pages. Their son, Elias, sat across from his mother, picking at his food with little appetite. Elias was different from his parents, in ways that puzzled the household staff. He'd been sent north for his education, had spent 2 years at a university in Pennsylvania, and he'd returned changed, quieter, more thoughtful. There was something troubled in his eyes, something that suggested he'd seen a world bigger and more complicated than the one that existed within the boundaries of Harwood Plantation. As Naomi refilled his coffee cup, Elias glanced up at her. "Thank you," he said softly. It was a small thing, just common courtesy, but it startled her. Most of the family didn't thank the hell. Most of them barely seemed to notice the enslaved people who moved through their lives like shadows. Later that morning, as Naomi worked in the kitchen preparing for the afternoon tea, she heard raised voices from the yard. Through the window, she could see Briggs talking with Micah, his posture aggressive, his finger jabbing the air for emphasis. Micah stood with his head slightly bowed, his shoulders tense, taking whatever criticism or command was being delivered. Naomi's hands stilled on the teacup she'd been polishing. A cold fear crept up her spine. Had something happened? Had someone said something? Elias appeared in the yard then, walking from the barn toward the manor. He paused, observing the interaction between Briggs and Micah with interest. Then his gaze shifted, and for a brief moment, his eyes met Naomi's through the kitchen window. Something passed across his face: recognition, maybe, or concern. Then he looked away and continued toward the house. Naomi forced her attention back to her work, but the unease remained, settling in her stomach like a stone. The afternoon stretched ahead, full of service and smiles and careful subservience. While outside, in the world beyond the manor's walls, she sensed something shifting, some change in the air that made her skin prickle with warning. When twilight finally came and she was released to return to the quarters, Naomi walked quickly across the darkening yard, her eyes searching for Micah. She needed to see him, needed to know he was all right, needed the reassurance of his steady presence. But as she approached the cabins, Sarah caught her arm. "Best get inside quick," Sarah whispered urgently. "Briggs has been watching everyone like a hawk all day. Something stirred him up." Naomi nodded and slipped into the women's cabin, her heart heavy with worry. Through the gaps in the wooden walls, she could see lanterns being extinguished one by one as curfew descended over the quarters. Somewhere out there, Micah was settling in for the night too, and she sent up a silent prayer that he was safe, that they both were safe, that the small joy they'd claimed for themselves wouldn't be snatched away before they'd barely had time to taste it. The night deepened around the plantation, bringing with it the usual sounds: insects singing, a breeze rustling through the cotton plants, the distant cry of some night creature hunting in the darkness. But beneath those familiar sounds, something else lingered. A tension, a waiting. Change was coming, though Naomi couldn't yet see its shape. All she knew was that the world felt different tonight, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. She clutched the blue ribbon beneath her pillow and whispered Micah's name like a prayer, hoping that somehow, across the distance between their cabins, he could feel her love reaching out to him through the dark. The next morning arrived, with a gray sky that promised rain. Levi stood outside the overseer's office, his hands clenched at his sides, his mouth dry as dust. He'd barely slept, tossing on his thin mattress while his thoughts churned like a storm-tossed sea. Now, in the pale morning light, he knocked on Briggs' door. "Enter," came the sharp command from within. Levi stepped inside the small room that smelled of tobacco and leather. Briggs sat behind his desk, ledger open, pen in hand. He looked up with impatient eyes. "What is it? Make it quick." The words stuck in Levi's throat for a moment. This was the precipice, the point of no return. He could still walk away, could still keep silent, but the bitterness in his chest pushed him forward like a hand at his back. "Sir, I thought you should know. There's been gatherings, unauthorized gatherings." The words tumbled out faster now. "Micah, he's been claiming a woman for himself, acting like he's got rights he don't have. Getting folks together, making vows and such." Briggs set down his pen slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Vows, yes, sir. Him and Naomi, the one who works in the kitchen. They had old Jonah perform some kind of ceremony. Back behind the quarters, secret-like." A dangerous smile played at the corners of Briggs' mouth. "Is that so?" Levi nodded, his heart hammering. Part of him felt sick, but another part felt vindicated. He'd been noticed. He'd been useful. Surely that counted for something. "Much obliged for the information." Briggs' voice was smooth as oil. "You can go now." Levi left quickly, not wanting to see what he'd set in motion. As he walked back toward the fields, he told himself he'd done the right thing. Micah had been stepping above his station. Someone needed to remind folks of their place. That's all this was: maintaining order. But deep down, in a place he didn't want to examine too closely, Levi knew the truth. He'd let jealousy and loneliness turn him into something ugly. He'd become the kind of man who'd betray his own people for a moment of feeling important in the eyes of someone who viewed them all as property anyway. Behind him, in that small office, Briggs made careful notes in his ledger. His smile grew wider. He'd been looking for an excuse to assert his authority more firmly, to remind the enslaved population who held the power here. This unauthorized marriage gave him exactly what he needed. The morning wore on, heavy with humidity and unspoken tension. Micah worked in the carpentry shed, his hands moving automatically while his mind wandered to Naomi, to the ribbon she'd hidden away, to the way her eyes had shone when Jonah pronounced them joined. He didn't notice Briggs approaching until the overseer's shadow fell across his workbench. "Micah." The voice was cold and sharp. "Sir." Micah set down his plane and turned, keeping his expression neutral. "I need you in the yard. Now. There's a matter that requires addressing." Something in Briggs' tone made Micah's stomach tighten, but he followed without question. What choice did he have? In the yard, other enslaved workers were being gathered, field hands and house servants alike, pulled from their tasks and assembled in a loose semicircle. Micah's eyes found Naomi immediately. She stood near the manor's back steps, still wearing her kitchen apron, her face pale with worry. When their gazes met, he saw his own fear reflected back at him. Briggs stood in the center of the yard, his posture that of a man about to deliver a sermon. Mr. Harwood had emerged onto the manor's back porch, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Harwood stood beside him, her hand at her throat. Elias appeared in a window, his face pressed close to the glass. "It has come to my attention," Briggs announced, his voice carrying across the yard, "that some among you have forgotten your place, have taken it upon yourselves to conduct ceremonies and make claims without permission from your master." A ripple of unease moved through the assembled group. Micah felt his pulse quicken. "Micah." Briggs pointed directly at him. "Step forward." Micah obeyed, his legs feeling like they'd turned to stone. Each step took enormous effort. "And Naomi, you too." Naomi moved forward on trembling legs, her hands clasped tightly together. When she reached Micah's side, he wanted desperately to take her hand, to offer comfort, but he didn't dare. "Is it true," Briggs demanded, his eyes boring into Micah, "that you participated in an unauthorized marriage ceremony, that you claimed this woman as your wife without seeking permission from Mr. Harwood?" The silence stretched taut as a rope. Micah could feel every eye on him, could sense the fear rolling off Naomi in waves. He had a choice: deny it, try to protect them both, or stand firm in the truth. He lifted his head and met Briggs' gaze directly. "We made vows before God, sir. That much is true." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Beside him, Naomi straightened her shoulders. "It's true," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "We are joined in the eyes of the Lord. We won't deny it." Briggs' smile was cruel and satisfied. "Won't deny it. You hear that, Mr. Harwood? They won't deny they're disobedient." From the porch, Mr. Harwood's face had turned an angry red. "This is unacceptable. Completely unacceptable. Briggs, handle this as you see fit. Make an example. The others need to understand what happens when rules are broken." "My thought exactly, sir." Briggs turned to two of the larger field hands. "Fetch the ropes, and bring that post near the barn." Terror shot through Micah's veins, but he forced himself to remain still. Beside him, Naomi had begun to shake. He moved slightly, just enough that his arm brushed against hers. Small contact, a reminder that she wasn't alone. Old Jonah pushed forward through the crowd. "Please, sir," he said, his aged voice carrying surprising strength. "They meant no harm. They only wanted to honor each other before God. That ain't a crime in the Lord's eyes." "The Lord's eyes don't run this plantation," Briggs snapped. "Now step back, old man, unless you want to join them." But Jonah didn't step back. Instead, he slowly lowered himself to his knees, right there in the dirt. His eyes closed, and his lips began to move in prayer. And then something remarkable happened. Sarah stepped forward and knelt beside Jonah, then Thomas, then Ruth. One by one, members of the enslaved community moved forward and dropped to their knees, their voices rising in prayer and song. The sound swelled, beautiful and defiant as spiritual, that spoke of crossing rivers and reaching promised lands, of burdens lifted and chains broken. It wasn't rebellion, not in any way that could be punished directly, but it was resistance. It was solidarity. It was a declaration that they were more than property, that they had spirits that couldn't be owned or broken. Micah felt tears burn his eyes. Naomi's hand found his and gripped it tight. They stood together at the center of this circle of love and support, and for one shining moment, the chains that bound them felt lighter. But Briggs' face had gone purple with rage. "Silence. All of you. Silence." The singing continued, perhaps even growing louder. On the porch, Mrs. Harwood had retreated inside, clearly disturbed. Mr. Harwood looked uncertain, as if he'd expected a different response: submission, perhaps, or fear. Not this unified display of humanity and faith. Elias had left the window. A moment later, he appeared on the porch beside his father. "Father," he said urgently, "perhaps this has gone far enough." "Be quiet, boy," Mr. Harwood snapped. "You understand nothing about managing a plantation." As the afternoon sun beat down on the yard, the community's prayers continued. Their voices rose and fell like waves, carrying hope and sorrow and unbreakable determination. Whatever punishment came, they would face it together. They would remember that they were human, that they were beloved, that no amount of cruelty could strip them of their essential dignity. When evening finally fell, and the yard grew quiet again, the enslaved workers returned to their quarters. They moved slowly, carrying the weight of what had transpired. Micah and Naomi had been separated, sent to different areas with strict warnings against speaking to each other. But as Naomi was escorted back to the manor for the night, Briggs wanted her under closer watch. She looked back over her shoulder one more time. Micah stood in the gathering darkness, his hand raised in a small wave. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that look past everything words couldn't say. Love, courage, a promise that no matter what came, they would endure. The morning after dawned cold and gray. A strange hush had fallen over the plantation, as if the very land was holding its breath. Briggs moved through the quarters before sunrise, barking new orders. Curfews were tightened. Movement between the cabins was restricted. Work assignments were shuffled to keep certain people apart. Micah found himself assigned to the furthest tobacco field, far from the manor and from any chance of seeing Naomi. The other men working alongside him were quiet, their usual chatter subdued. Everyone could feel it, the tightening of chains, the reminder that any small freedom could be revoked in an instant. In the manor kitchen, Naomi worked with hands that felt numb. Cook kept glancing at her with worried eyes, but said nothing. What was there to say? They all knew how these situations went. The masters held all the power, and the enslaved could only endure and hope and pray. Mrs. Harwood appeared in the kitchen doorway mid-morning, her face pinched. Naomi, you'll sleep in the manor from now on. There's a small room off the kitchen. Bessie will show you. Yes, ma'am. The words came automatically, but inside, Naomi felt a door slamming shut. Sleeping in the manor meant being even more separated from Micah, from the community in the quarters, from any sense of belonging to something larger than servitude. That night, lying on a thin pallet in the cramped room that smelled of onions and old grease, Naomi stared at the dark ceiling and let silent tears slip down her cheeks. She clutched the blue ribbon to her chest and whispered prayers into the darkness. Somewhere out there, under the same stars, Micah was doing the same. Their love had become a secret thing again, hidden and suppressed. But it wasn't extinguished. It couldn't be extinguished. Not by Briggs. Not by the Harwoods. Not by any power on earth. Love, she thought, was the one thing they couldn't take away. Even if they sold her tomorrow, even if they sent Micah to the furthest corner of the South, the love would remain printed on her heart, woven into her soul, eternal as the stars themselves. Outside, the night creatures called their lonely songs. Inside, Naomi closed her eyes and let herself remember Micah's steady hands, his quiet strength, the way his eyes had shone when Jonah tied the ribbon around their wrists. These memories were treasures, precious beyond measure, and she'd guard them fiercely against anything that tried to steal them away. 2 days later, something unexpected happened. A visitor arrived at Harwood Plantation, a traveling preacher named Reverend Amos Blackwell. He came in a simple wagon drawn by an old mule, his clothes plain but respectable, his face weathered by sun and wind and years of traveling from place to place. Mr. Harwood was pleased by the visit. He liked the appearance of piety, liked being seen as a good Christian man who provided spiritual guidance for his workers. He gave Reverend Amos permission to hold a Sunday service for the enslaved community. What Mr. Harwood didn't know was that Reverend Amos carried more than just Bible verses in his heart. He carried maps. He carried names and addresses. He carried knowledge of a network that stretched north like invisible threads. The Underground Railroad, people called it, though it involved neither trains nor tracks, just brave souls willing to help the enslaved find their way to freedom. Old Jonah recognized something in Reverend Amos the moment they met. It was in the way the preacher's eyes lingered on the faces around him, taking in their conditions with a gaze that held both compassion and determination. After the Sunday breakfast, when most folks were resting before the evening service, Jonah found a moment to speak with Amos privately behind the cabins. Reverend Jonah said carefully, "There's a couple here, good people, who've recently joined their lives together, but they're facing ... difficulties." Amos nodded slowly, his expression understanding. "Tell me more." And so Jonah did. He spoke of Micah and Naomi, of their courage in making vows, despite the dangers, of Briggs' cruelty and the tightening restrictions. He spoke of rumors he'd heard, that Briggs was considering separating them permanently, perhaps even selling one or both downriver, to the deep south, where conditions were even harsher. Reverend Amos listened with the intensity of a man who'd heard such stories before, who knew their weight and their urgency. When Jonah finished, the preacher was quiet for a long moment. "I may be able to help," he said finally, "but it would require great courage from them, great risk. The road to freedom is dangerous, and there are no guarantees. Freedom, Jonah repeated, tasting the word. Is it truly possible? With God's help and good planning, yes. But they'd need to be willing to leave everything behind, to trust in strangers, to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, as scripture says. Jonah nodded slowly. I'll speak with them, careful like. Tonight, Amos said. After full dark, behind the last cabin, where the trees provide cover, can you bring them? I can. They parted then, each returning to their visible duties, while their hearts raced with the magnitude of what they'd begun. Plans for escape were dangerous, not just for those fleeing, but for anyone who helped. Discovery meant brutal punishment, whippings, brandings, being sold to far worse situations, or even death. But sometimes, Jonah thought as he made his way back toward the quarters, the risk of staying was greater than the risk of running. Sometimes love demanded courage beyond reason. Sometimes faith required stepping into the unknown with nothing but hope to light the way. That evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, like butter on a hot stone, the plantation settled into its usual rhythms. Supper fires burned low in the quarters. In the manor, the Harwoods finished their meal and retired to the parlor. Briggs made his rounds, checking that everyone was accounted for, that the rules were being followed. But beneath the surface calm, something stirred. Jonah moved slowly between the cabins, his aged steps drawing no suspicion. He paused at the men's quarters, where Micah sat on his bunk, staring at nothing. With a subtle gesture, Jonah caught his attention, then moved on. The message was clear: wait, watch, follow when safe. Getting word to Naomi proved trickier. She was trapped in the manor, under Mrs. Harwood's watchful eye. But cook Bessie, who'd seen more heartbreak and joy in her years than most folks could imagine, understood what was happening. When Naomi came to help with the evening dishes, Bessie leaned close. Child, old Jonah needs to see you tonight. Behind the last cabin, after the moon rises. Can you slip out? Naomi's hands trembled in the dishwater. I don't know if I can. Mrs. Harwood keeps checking on me. She takes her sleeping draft at 9 o'clock sharp. Knocks her out cold till morning. Wait till then. Bessie's eyes were kind but urgent. This might be important. Child, might be real important. So Naomi waited. She prepared Mrs. Harwood's bedtime tea, adding the drops of laudanum that the mistress relied on for sleep. She tidied the kitchen with extra care, banking the fire and covering the bread dough for morning. She went to her small room and lay down fully clothed, her ears straining for every sound in the house. When the grandfather clock in the hall struck 10, and the manor had been silent for near an hour, Naomi rose. She moved like a ghost through the dark kitchen, easing open the back door with aching slowness. The hinges creaked softly, a sound that seemed loud as thunder in the quiet night, but no one stirred. The yard stretched before her, bathed in moonlight. She could see the cabins in the distance, dark shapes against darker shadows. Her heart hammered so hard she thought surely someone would hear it. But she moved forward, keeping to the shadows, praying with every step. At the last cabin, 3 figures waited in the darkness beneath the trees. Old Jonah, Reverend Amos, and her breath caught Micah. She hadn't seen him up close in days, and the sight of him made something break open in her chest. He reached for her as she approached, and she fell into his arms, pressing her face against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of hymnwood shavings and honest sweat and something uniquely Micah. For a moment they just held each other, letting the embrace speak all the words they couldn't say aloud. We don't have much time, Reverend Amos said gently, so I'll speak plain. There are people, good people, who can help you reach freedom. A network that stretches north to states where slavery is outlawed. It's dangerous. Many don't make it, but some do. And those who do, they get to live as God intended, free. Naomi pulled back from Micah, but kept hold of his hand. How? How would we even begin? Amos spoke in low, urgent tones. He told them about safe houses, about conductors who guided escapees along secret routes, about the North Star that would lead them toward freedom. He told them about a free black family 30 miles north, who could shelter them for a few days, give them supplies for the next leg of the journey. But you'd need to leave soon, he warned. Word is, Briggs is planning to sell one or both of you, maybe within the week. Once you're on a slave coffle, heading south, escape becomes near impossible. Micah's hand tightened around Naomi's. We'd be together. That's the plan. But I won't lie to you, it's hard. You'll travel at night, hide during the day. You'll be hungry and cold and scared. Dogs might track you. Patrollers might catch you. And if they do, ... double quotes, he didn't need to finish that sentence. They all knew what happened to captured runaways. But if you make it, Jonah added, his voice thick with emotion, you'd be free, truly free. Free to live as husband and wife, to build a life, to have children who'd be born free. That's worth fighting for, ain't it? Naomi looked at Micah, and in his eyes she saw the same mixture of terror and hope that churned in her own heart. They'd lived their whole lives in chains, invisible chains, mostly, woven from law and custom, and the threat of violence. The idea of breaking free seemed impossible, like wishing to fly or touch the moon. But Micah had asked her once if she thought they deserved more than this life, and she'd said yes. She'd meant it then, and she meant it now. When? Micah asked simply. Tomorrow night, Amos said. I'll leave at dawn, but I'll have everything arranged. There's an old tobacco barn, about 2 miles north on the property line. It's abandoned, half fallen down. You'll find supplies hidden there, under the floorboards in the back corner. Food, warmer clothes, a compass, a map. Wait there until full dark, then head northwest. Follow the creek until you reach the big oak with the white blaze mark. From there, ... he continued with detailed instructions, while Naomi and Micah listened intently, committing every word to memory. This was their one chance. There would be no written notes, no second explanation. They had to get it right the first time. When Amos finished, silence fell over the small group. The magnitude of what they were planning settled over them like a heavy blanket. I wish I could go with you, Jonah said, his voice breaking. Lord knows I wish I was young enough to make that journey. Micah embraced the old man. You're coming with us in spirit. Your prayers, your teaching, they've kept us strong. They'll keep us strong on the road ahead. Naomi hugged Jonah too, tears streaming down her face. This man had been like a father to so many in the quarters, a source of wisdom and comfort and strength. Leaving him behind felt like tearing away a piece of her own heart. You go with God, Jonah whispered, and you remember you're his children. Nobody can take that from you, nobody. They parted then, each slipping back to their assigned places. Naomi made it back to the manor without incident, though her legs shook so badly she could barely walk. She lay on her pallet, eyes wide open, watching the darkness slowly give way to gray dawn. Tomorrow night, she thought. Tomorrow night, everything changes. In the men's quarters, Micah lay equally sleepless, his mind racing through the plan again and again. 2 miles north, abandoned tobacco barn, supplies under the floorboards, northwest by the creek, the white blazed oak, then onto the safe house where friends waited. It seemed both impossibly complicated and dangerously simple. So many things could go wrong, but staying meant certain separation, meant being sold away from each other, meant living the rest of their lives as property instead of people. No, he thought, we have to try. Even if we fail, at least we'll fail reaching for something better. The next day crawled past with agonizing slowness. Micah worked in the tobacco field, his hands moving automatically, while his mind stayed fixed on the evening ahead. Every time Briggs rode past on his horse, Micah's heart leaped with fear. Did the overseer suspect something? Had someone talked? But the day passed without incident. Just another day of labor under the hot sun. Another day of bowing and scraping, and pretending to be less than human. In the manor, Naomi moved through her chores in a daze. She prepared vegetables for supper, her knife slicing through carrots and potatoes with mechanical precision. She served the Harwood family their meal, filling water glasses and removing empty plates, all while her thoughts spun ahead to darkness and flight and freedom. Elias Harwood watched her with curious eyes during supper. She felt his gaze on her several times and wondered what he saw. Could he sense that something had changed? Could he tell that the woman serving his food was already half gone, her spirit already reaching toward that abandoned tobacco barn and the journey beyond? But he said nothing, and the meal passed like all the others. What no one knew, what Naomi and Micah couldn't have known, was that Levi's conscience had been eating at him. The guilt of his betrayal had grown from a small seed into a choking vine that wrapped around his heart. He'd watched Micah working in the fields, had seen Naomi's pale face, and something in him had finally broken. That afternoon, while fetching water from the well, Levi overheard fragments of conversation. He'd been hidden behind the well house when Jonah and another field hand named Samuel spoke in low voices. ... Tomorrow night. Barn on the north property line. Pray they make it. ... Levi's blood ran cold. Escape. They were planning an escape. And it was his fault, wasn't it? His betrayal had pushed them to this desperate measure. He stood frozen behind the well house, his mind racing. He could go to Briggs again, could earn more favor by revealing this plot, could ensure his own safety by sacrificing theirs. Or he could stay silent, could let them try for freedom, could begin to atone for what he'd already done. The war inside him raged fiercer than ever. But this time, something different happened. This time, the better part of his nature, the part that remembered his own mother being sold away when he was just a boy, the part that still dreamed of freedom even though he'd learned to bury those dreams, deep, that part finally won. Levi walked away from Briggs' office. He went to his cabin and sat on his bunk, shaking with the weight of his decision. He wouldn't help them. He wasn't brave enough for that. But he wouldn't betray them again either. He'd stay silent. It was the least he could do. The very least. Night fell soft and warm, bringing with it the chorus of frogs and crickets. In the quarters, folks settled in for sleep, unaware that 2 of their number were preparing to do something that would either lead to freedom or death. Micah waited until the cabin was quiet, until the breathing of the other men deepened into sleep. Then he rose silently, moving like smoke toward the door. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst from his chest, but his hands were steady. This was it. No turning back now. He slipped into the night, keeping to the shadows, moving north toward the property line. Every sound made him freeze: the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog. But he pressed on, driven by love and hope and desperation, all mixed together. At the manor, Naomi waited for the house to fall silent. Mrs. Harwood had taken her draft. Mr. Harwood's snores rumbled from the master bedroom. The servants were all abed. She rose, her small bundle clutched to her chest. It held nothing but the blue ribbon and a spare head wrap. But it was all she could carry, without raising suspicion. She moved through the dark kitchen, her feet knowing the way by heart. The back door opened with barely a whisper. And then she was outside, under the vast starry sky, taking her first steps toward the unknown. The 2 miles to the abandoned barn felt like 200. Every shadow seemed to hide every sound threatened discovery. But Naomi walked on, guided by the North Star, and by faith, and by the knowledge that Micah was somewhere ahead, waiting for her. When she finally reached the old tobacco barn, a sagging structure, with half its roof gone, she saw him standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the lesser darkness inside. Relief flooded through her so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. He caught her as she stumbled forward, and they held each other while the night sounds sang around them. For a moment, just a moment, they let themselves feel the enormity of what they'd done. They'd taken the first step. They'd chosen freedom. The supplies, Micah whispered. Let me find them. He moved to the back corner and began feeling along the floorboards. His fingers found a loose board, and beneath it, yes, a package wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, dried meat, hardtack to canteens of water, warmer clothes, and the promised compass and map. They changed quickly, shedding their plantation clothes for the dark, rough garments that would help them blend into the night. Naomi tucked the blue ribbon inside her new dress, close to her heart. Then they looked at each other in the dimness, and without words, they understood. It was time to go, time to run, time to chase the dream of freedom, even if it meant running until their legs gave out, hiding in swamps and thickets, trusting in strangers and providence and the deep, abiding love that had brought them to this moment. Micah took Naomi's hand. You ready? She squeezed back. With you, I'm ready for anything. They stepped out of the barn into the starlit darkness. Behind them lay everything they'd ever known: the plantation, the quarters, old Jonah, and the others who'd become family. Ahead lay uncertainty and danger, and the possibility of a life they'd only dared to imagine. But they were together, and that made all the difference. They began to walk northwest, following the creek, just as Reverend Amos had instructed, their eyes on the North Star, their hearts full of hope and terror and a fierce, unshakable determination. The night embraced them, and they disappeared into its sheltering darkness. 2 souls reaching for freedom, bound together by love stronger than any chains could ever be. Behind them, the plantation slept on, unaware that 2 of its captives had slipped away like morning mist, leaving nothing behind but empty cabins and the memory of courage that would inspire those who remained. Somewhere in his quarters, old Jonah woke suddenly from sleep. He rose and went to his small window, looking out at the stars. And though he couldn't see them, couldn't know for certain that they'd made it even this far, he smiled. Go on, children, he whispered to the night. Go on to freedom. We'll be praying for you every step of the way. And in the darkness, following the water that would lead them north, Micah and Naomi walked hand in hand into their future, uncertain, but together, afraid but free, carrying nothing but each other, and a hope that refused to die. Dawn was still an hour away when the alarm bells began to ring. Briggs had discovered the empty cabins during his early morning rounds. His roar of rage woke half the plantation as he stormed through the quarters, throwing open doors, counting heads, his face purple with fury. They're gone. Micah and that kitchen girl, they've run. The enslaved workers stumbled from their cabins, fear written on every face. Runaway slaves meant punishment for everyone: tighter restriction, reduced rations, increased suspicion. And if they were caught and brought back, what happened next would serve as a brutal warning to anyone else who dared to dream of freedom. Mr. Harwood emerged from the manor in his nightshirt and robe, his face slack with shock. How could this happen? How could they slip past the patrols? I don't know, sir, but I intend to find out. Briggs' eyes swept over the assembled workers, like a hawk searching for prey. Someone knew about this. Someone helped them. And I will discover who. Old Jonah stood among the others, his face calm despite the storm raging around him. He said nothing, revealed nothing, but inside, his heart sang with hope. They'd made it out. At least they'd gotten that far. Within the hour, Briggs had assembled a search party, 6 men with dogs and rifles, ready to track the runaways. The hounds bayed and strained at their leashes, excited by the scent trail. The party mounted up and thundered north, following the obvious path toward the property line. In the manor, Mrs. Harwood sat at the breakfast table, her face pinched with displeasure. This is what comes of being too lenient, Mr. Harwood. Those people need a firm hand, not kindness. Elias sat across from his parents, his food untouched. Something twisted in his gut, a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite name. Part of him felt the reflexive anger of property loss that he'd been raised to feel. But another part, the part that had studied in the North, that had read Douglas and heard abolitionists speak, that part felt something different. Hope. He felt hope for Micah and Naomi. Hope that they'd escape the dogs and the guns. Hope that they'd find the freedom he'd been born into, but they'd been denied. Father, he said carefully, perhaps we should consider. Not now, Elias. Mr. Harwood waved him off. This is plantation business. You've been away too long. You don't understand how things work here. But Elias did understand. That was the problem. He understood all too well, and the understanding sat in his stomach like a stone. Miles away, Micah and Naomi pushed through the pre-dawn darkness, their legs burning with effort. They'd followed the creek for hours, wading through the cold water to mask their scent from tracking dogs. The water soaked their clothes and made their teeth chatter, but they didn't slow down. There, Micah said, pointing ahead. The big oak. I can see the white mark. Relief flooded through Naomi. They'd made it to the first landmark. They were still on course. She wanted to collapse right there, to rest her aching legs and catch her breath. But Micah urged her forward. Can't stop yet. Got to get to the safe house before full light. They veered away from the creek, following the map's directions through thick woods. Branches caught at their clothes and scratched their faces. Twice they heard sounds that made them freeze. Once, a deer crashing through the underbrush. Once, distant voices that might have been searchers, or might have been farmers starting their day's work. The sky was turning gray when they finally saw it, a small cabin set back from the road, a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. A lantern hung in the window, its light warm and welcoming. This was it. This was the safe house. Micah approached cautiously, his hand tight around Naomi's. They'd been told to knock 3 times, pause, then twice more. He did so, his heart hammering. The door opened a crack, and a dark face peered out, a woman, middle-aged, with kind eyes and worry lines etched deep. She took in their appearance in one swift glance, then swung the door wide. Come in, quick now. You must be the ones Reverend Amos told us about. They stumbled inside, and the woman, she said her name was Ruth Freeman, and she'd been born free, right here in this very cabin, immediately set about caring for them. She brought warm food, dry clothes, and most precious of all, reassurance. You're safe here for now, she said, ladling hot soup into wooden bowls. My husband Isaac is out keeping watch. We'll know if anyone comes near. Naomi's hands shook so badly she could barely hold her spoon. Now that they'd stopped running, now that they were relatively safe, the enormity of what they'd done crashed over her like a wave. They'd run. They'd actually run. There was no going back now. Micah seemed to sense her thoughts. He reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. We did it, he said softly. First step. We're going to make it, Naomi. All the way to freedom. Ruth Freeman smiled at them, her eyes misty. You got the look of folks in love. That's good. Love will carry you when nothing else can. I've seen many runaways come through here over the years. The ones who make it there, the ones who got something worth running for. Not just something they're running from. They spent the day in the Freeman's root cellar. A cool, dark space beneath the cabin, where Ruth stored her vegetables and preserves. It wasn't comfortable, but it was hidden. If searchers came, they'd never find a concealed door, unless they knew exactly where to look. Lying in the darkness, pressed close together for warmth and comfort, Micah and Naomi whispered to each other. They talked about their fears, about what might lie ahead, about the life they hoped to build once they reached the north. I want a little house, Naomi said dreamily. Nothing fancy, just a place that's ours, where we can come and go as we please, where nobody can tell us what to do or when to do it. I'll build it for you, Micah promised. I'm good with my hands. I can make us a fine home, and maybe someday we'll have children. Children who'll never know. chains. Who'll be born free? The thought was so beautiful, it made Naomi's throat tight with emotion. You think it's really possible? A life like that? I got to believe it is. Otherwise, what are we doing here? Above them, they heard footsteps, heavy boots on the cabin floor. Men's voices, rough and demanding. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. Micah pulled her closer, his body tense as a bowstring. Checking all the properties in the area, a voice said. 2 runaways from the Harwood place. A man and a woman. You seen anything suspicious? Ruth Freeman's voice, calm and steady. No, sir. Been just me and my husband here. Quiet as can be. You won't mind if we look around then? Course not. Look all you like. The footsteps moved through the cabin. Micah and Naomi held perfectly still, barely breathing. The searchers were right above them. Just a few feet separated them from capture, from punishment, from the end of all their hopes. A boot heel landed directly on the cellar door. The searchers stood there for a long moment, and Naomi was certain he'd discover them. But then he moved on, his footsteps retreating toward the door. Much obliged for your cooperation, Mrs. Freeman. Any time, sir. I hope you find what you're looking for. Oh, we will. Dogs picked up their trail heading this direction. They can't have gone far. The voices faded. The door closed. Silence settled over the cabin. Long minutes passed before Ruth opened the cellar door and called down softly. They're gone. But they'll be watching the roads now. We need to get you moved tonight, sooner than planned. Back at Harwood Plantation, Briggs returned empty-handed, and in a foul temper. The dogs had followed the scent to the creek, and then lost it. The searchers had checked every cabin and barn within 10 miles, but found nothing. They had help. Briggs snarled to Mr. Harwood. Professional help. This wasn't just 2 slaves running blind. Someone planned this. Mr. Harwood's face was grim. Then we need to send word further afield. Contact the slave catchers in the next county. Offer a reward. Make it substantial enough that every poor farmer and bounty hunter will be watching for them. In the quarters that evening, the mood was somber. Old Jonah led a prayer service, his words carefully chosen to avoid suspicion but carrying deeper meaning for those who understood. Lord, we pray for those who walk through dark valleys. We pray for your protection over the wandering and the lost. We pray for courage for those who seek the promised land, and strength for those who wait in hope. Amen. The others murmured, Amen. Levi sat at the back of the gathering, his head bowed, tears streaming silently down his face. He'd stayed quiet. He hadn't betrayed them again. But the guilt of his first betrayal still ate at him like acid. If they were caught, if they were killed, it would be partly his fault. That knowledge would haunt him till his dying day. In the manor, Elias lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. He'd heard his father discussing the reward posters that would be printed and distributed. He'd heard Briggs talk about what punishments awaited if the runaways were captured. Something crystallized inside him, then a decision that had been forming since he'd first watched Micah and Naomi stand together in that yard, refusing to deny their love, even in the face of punishment. He couldn't change the whole system. He was just one person. But maybe he could help these 2 people. Maybe that would be enough. He rose from his bed, lit a candle, and began to write. First, a note to Reverend Amos, if he could track the man down. Then, more practically, a letter to an abolitionist organization in Philadelphia that he'd learned about during his time up north. And finally, he pulled out his personal ledger, the accounting of his inheritance from his late grandfather. Money his father couldn't touch, money that was his alone to use, as he saw fit. If money could buy freedom, then he'd spend every last dollar to make it happen. 2 nights later, Micah and Naomi were hidden in the back of a farmer's wagon, covered with hay and empty feed sacks, being transported to the next stop on the Underground Railroad. The wagon jolted over rough roads, and they clung to each other in the darkness, every bump and rattle testing their courage. They'd been traveling this way for days, now moving at night, hiding during the day, passed from one safe house to another like precious cargo. They'd met Quakers and free blacks, white abolitionists and Native Americans, who'd never recognized slavery as lawful. Each person risked their own safety to help, and the gratitude Micah and Naomi felt was beyond words. But the journey was taking its toll. They were exhausted, half-starved, despite the food their helpers provided, and constantly terrified of discovery. Twice more they'd nearly been caught, once when patrollers stopped the wagon they were hidden in, once when they'd had to flee a safe house that was suddenly surrounded. How much farther? Naomi whispered in the darkness of the wagon. Don't know exactly, Micah whispered back, but we're heading north. Every mile is a mile closer to free territory. I'm scared, Micah. I know. I am too. But we keep going. We have to keep going. The wagon rolled on through the night, carrying them toward an uncertain future. Behind them, the slave catchers still searched. Ahead of them, Freedom beckoned like a distant star. And all around them, despite the danger and the darkness, love held them together. Love strong enough to brave the impossible, to endure the unbearable, to hope for the seemingly hopeless. They were no longer Harwood's property. They were no longer bound by the chains of slavery, even if those chains still sought to reclaim them. They were Micah and Naomi, husband and wife before God, two free souls fighting their way toward a life where they could live openly, proudly, as the people they were always meant to be. 3 weeks after their escape, Elias Harwood sat in Reverend Amos's small study, his hands clasped tight in his lap. The preacher had been hard to find, but Elias had persevered, traveling under the pretext of visiting friends in a neighboring county. "They're in grave danger," Amos said bluntly. "There are slave catchers on their trail, professional bounty hunters who won't give up easily, and I've received word that your father plans to have them sold immediately if they're captured sent south where escape would be impossible. Then we have to prevent their capture," Elias said firmly. "What can I do?" Amos studied the young man before him. "You understand what you're risking. If your father learns of your involvement, I understand, but I can't stand by any longer. I've been complicit through my silence, through my inaction. That ends now." A slow smile spread across Amos's weathered face. "Then I have a plan. It's risky, very risky, but if it works, it could save them both." He spread a map on the table and began to explain. Micah and Naomi had been traveling north, yes, but their route was being monitored. Slave catchers had figured out the general path of the Underground Railroad in this region. What they needed was a diversion and a legal strategy. "There's an auction scheduled in 2 weeks, Amos explained, in Richmond, a large regional auction where slaves from multiple estates are sold. Your father, I've learned, has already made arrangements to have Micah and Naomi brought there. If they're captured along with several others, he's planning to sell anyway. So we intercept them at the auction," Elias said slowly, beginning to understand. "Exactly. But it requires perfect timing. We need them to be caught or to turn themselves in and brought to that auction. And we need you there with the means to purchase them, legally, in front of witnesses. And then I free them immediately, using manumission papers prepared in advance. Yes, it's the one way to break the legal claim your father has on them. Once they're sold to you, they're your property, and you can free them on the spot if you choose." Elias felt his pulse quicken. It could work. It was dangerous and complicated, and required everything to fall into place perfectly. But it could work. How do we get word to them? How do we let them know they need to surrender at a specific place and time? "That," Amos said, "is where the network comes in. I have conductors who can reach them, who can explain the plan. But Elias, they'll have to trust that you're genuine. They'll have to believe that a white man, a slaveholder's son, is truly willing to help them. Then we have to make them believe it, show them proof, give them something that demonstrates my commitment, beyond any doubt." They worked late into the night, crafting messages, preparing documents, arranging finances. Elias signed over a substantial portion of his inheritance, enough to cover the purchase price, and have money left over to give Micah and Naomi a genuine start in their new life. As dawn broke, Elias rode back toward Harwood Plantation, his heart lighter than it had been in months. He was finally doing something that mattered, finally standing on the right side of history, even if it meant standing against his own family. The pieces were in motion now. The only question was whether Micah and Naomi would reach Richmond in time and whether they'd have the courage to walk voluntarily into the very place they'd been running from, trusting that salvation awaited them on the other side.